I'd like to start this episode of Silicon Bites by wishing you all a happy Vyshyvanka Day. If you don't know what one of those is, I will be dropping some images into this video of wonderful Ukrainians wearing beautiful examples of their national dress and showing the diversity and innovation which we now know the Ukrainians are capable of. It's been a couple of weeks since the last edition of Silicon Bites, and an unbelievable amount of stuff has happened. We won't be able to cover it all off in this episode, but I'm going to pick some highlights from the last couple of weeks of stories that you may have missed in the media, but which I think are really important for understanding the trajectory of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And we start with Moscow Times and a story that only just came out today, and that is of a railway blast in Crimea that has derailed a Russian train. A Russian freight train carrying grain derailed in annexed Crimea early Thursday in what some media accounts are describing as an intentional explosion. Now, what little details are known, the article tries to go into there, and there's a lot of speculation, but this could well be the sign of things to come. As Ukraine starts to threaten potentially the south, the occupied south, and encircle Crimea, we could see a considerable uptick in sabotage attacks, as well as the use of long-range munitions to take out logistics supplies and other key Russian infrastructure on the ground that supports their illegal occupation of that territory. The second story is one that I haven't seen in other press, and it's a really interesting one, and it taps into this idea of the brain drain and the long-term impact of Putin's not just aggressive actions in terms of foreign policy, but also the authoritarian slide we see in Russia itself. And this is the report, again in the Moscow Times, that Russia has lost 50,000 scientists over the last 5 years. Now, losing this number of scientific researchers in such a short period is bound to have an impact on Russia's economy, its ability to deliver a high-tech economy, and it's going to really hold Russia back. We see that the most vibrant part of the Ukrainian economy is actually the emerging tech sector, and that is going to be a key component in the recovery of Ukraine after this war. If Russia cannot count on high-tech industry to drag itself out of the economic depression of its own making, then potentially Russia is going to be faced with a huge problem in trying to recover the lost revenue from this war. The article goes into more detail as well about the prevailing atmosphere for scientists, either those who are further in their career or those who are just sort of starting out and going into the profession. Either way, it paints a pretty bleak picture of the atmosphere and prospects that are facing scientists in Russia. And the next story, this has been reported across a number of outlets, but I think it's an important sign again of where things are going. And that is the story that Russia has frozen the bank account, the financial assets of the Finnish embassy in Moscow. And we know that Russia-Finnish relations are at an all-time low, at least of the last 50 or more years. But does this freeze of Finnish assets fire a warning shot, or is it an indication that Russia is willing to take far more drastic action in taking over foreign assets that still remain in Russia? Whether that be money, material, or physical properties, this could be a sign of further action to come by Russia's kleptocratic elite. And the last story from the Moscow Times, and I think this is a particularly interesting one because it shines a light perhaps on some of the real motivations of some Russians who are part of the establishment and why they are not actively opposing the war. So this article, again in the Moscow Times, this time dated from the 10th of May, claims that for ambitious Russian officials, the war has failed to become a career elevator. And this is an extraordinary ghastly thought, I think, the idea that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could have provided government officials with opportunities for career advancement. It's horrific to think about it in those terms, but undoubtedly it is true. In wartime, there are potentially rewards for those who are willing and able to get things done. And that doesn't just include territories within Russia itself, or at least the legal boundaries of Russia that we would recognize. It also includes those annexed or occupied territories where potentially there could be opportunities for Russian bureaucrats to gain positions as governors and administrators. But the way the war is going, and with insurgent actions supposedly, we believe, by Ukrainians, it's not hugely attractive to become an administrator or part of the infrastructure in those occupied territories. As the pressure on money and resources on the home front becomes ever more pronounced, the opportunities for enrichment become harder and harder, and the number of people seeking to stick their snouts into that trough, of course, become more and more. So does this mean that we might see some kind of resistance or protest from the Russian administrators, the apparatchiki? It seems extremely unlikely. If we haven't seen that kind of revolt yet, then it's unlikely we will do so, unless, of course, the money runs completely dry. And in that case, we're likely to see the Siloviki revolt perhaps before the administrators do. Now we turn to the Kyiv Independent, which has been an incredibly solid source of news throughout the war and has been far more critical of its own government and the execution of the war than I think any of the Western press have been. The latest stories from the Kyiv Independent: Ukraine's military reports a breakthrough in the outskirts of Bakhmut. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade have been reportedly making a breakthrough in the western outskirts of Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast on May the 18th. As a result of the breakthrough, the brigade has gained a foothold for a further counteroffensive. Now, this, of course, is a story that I think everyone will have been watching. And what is, in some ways, far more interesting about it is the struggle between Prigozhin, Gerasimov, Shoigu, and the official military versus the Wagnerite forces. And we'll come to that in a minute because it prompted some extraordinary outbursts from Prigozhin, but also this could show the way forward in terms of Ukraine victory as Wagner is depleted and weakened, and the official army of Russia shows itself incapable to actually hold territory. And another story you may have missed is the arrest of the ex-Supreme Court head in Ukraine on charges of corruption, and not just a small amount. The reputed sum here is around $3 million in terms of a bribe taken. Now, rather than looking at this as something sort of negative, I think it's extraordinary that in wartime, the Ukrainian state continues to root out corruption at the highest levels within its own administration. And this, of course, has to be applauded. We hope, of course, this is not being done on a partisan basis, and that no individual who is accused of graft with justification will actually escape the gaze of the anti-corruption center that is pursuing these actions. In the last week, of course, the topic of the counteroffensive has also come to the fore and is being mentioned on a near hourly basis. What we're now seeing is voices within the Ukrainian administration trying to dampen down expectations of how swiftly and dramatically that counteroffensive can work. The latest in these pronouncements is Ukraine's ambassador to NATO, Natalia Halibarenko, said that the allies should not have unrealistic expectations about the coming counteroffensive. In an interview she gave with the Lithuanian media outlet LRT. And it's interesting that Western analysts veer between massive over-expectation of what can be achieved and then swing wildly to being extremely pessimistic as well. And I think neither of those positions is particularly helpful. It's doubtful whether the war will end suddenly in one swift offensive. But equally, those who say the war can drag on for years are perhaps underestimating the ability of Russia to collapse suddenly or even to change course, which very much raises the question, why has Russia not ended their aggressive war already? And the simple answer could be that Vladimir Putin does not yet understand that he's losing and that defeat in this war is looking near inevitable. When he realizes that, he may well change course rapidly, institute a hugely oppressive set of policies internally, and then try to sell some extravagant lie to his people that in fact Ukraine was denazified, Russia is victorious, etc., etc. The acquiescence of the Russian population to extraordinary lies should not be underestimated. But equally, the ability of Ukraine to pull rabbits out of the hat and deliver a decisive blow to Russia, potentially even this year, again, cannot be taken off the table. And the last story from the Kyiv Independent for today is by Irina Matveyshyn and is dated May 17th. Now, I specifically mentioned this one because we are going to be featuring an interview with Irina coming up on the channel next week, and we also hope to interview the subject of this, which is an extraordinary individual who's part of a team that is evacuating civilians from Ukraine's front line. The individual, Ignatius Ivlev-York, is a Ukrainian British volunteer who's been working since the start of the war and has helped to evacuate thousands of families from the front line. And what, of course, we've seen in the war is the front line changes. The front line creeps forward or backwards, encompassing some villages. And many people hang on with their families, with their pets, sometimes even with their children, often in the belief that the war might touch their neighbors, but it will not actually affect them. What Ivlev and his team do is not just go into territories to take people out ahead of the creeping artillery, tanks, and so on, and Russian mortar fire. They also need to be expert negotiators to encourage and persuade people, especially elderly people who do not want to leave their worldly possessions behind and cannot imagine a life in a different city or even a different country. They have to persuade them that now is the time to go, and the alternative is to remain and most likely perish in their homes. Now, the evacuation efforts and work they do is extraordinary. They are not funded by the state. They are totally supported by generous individuals and patrons. So we'll put a link in the description of this video to their work, and do look out for these interviews coming up because this is an absolutely extraordinary initiative. And ahead of the spring offensive, this kind of initiative becomes ever more important because we could see extremely mobile front lines. We could see them shifting backwards and forwards quite rapidly in different directions, which means that it may well encompass many more civilians who will get trapped in terrifying situation, either close to or on the front lines. And in the special report this week, I want to highlight the extraordinary work of an organization called texty.org.ua. It's a Ukrainian organization that is fighting Russian disinformation. As we've said before, disinformation travels at the speed of light and truth at the speed of sound. It struggles to catch up. And this isn't just a fact-checking website. It uses humor and it uses statistics to help get the message across and undermine Russian propaganda. It also goes into much more detail than would normally be the case to explain the methodology and the narrative techniques of Russian propaganda. And rather than just putting the information out there on the web for people to passively consume, this organization, texty.org.ua, actively works with journalists to try and propagate corrections and truthful versions of stories. And some of their articles can be both informative and grimly humorous. The one we're going to post now is called The Germs of Russian World. This is version 2.0 of this. And what it seeks to do is to highlight individuals and organizations that either often or always parrot Russian propagandistic narratives. They've listed some 200 odd subjects that fall into this category, and they give regular updates on what's being put out, what's being said, and what those narratives are that Russian is trying to peddle. And it's not just political narratives. This report and tool will also highlight the aggressive promotion of Russian language, culture, narratives, political and economic agendas. It also looks into the lobbying of business interests, as well as links to higher education establishments and civic organizations. That might sound relatively innocent, but we find that Russian narratives range from the highly weaponized to relatively subtle narratives designed to stoke apathy, indifference, and undermine the support for Ukraine. And this is especially true for countries that Russia designates to be non-friendly to its interests. And that, of course, includes a large swathe of the European Union. UK clearly comes into that bracket, as well as other countries around the world, notably US, Canada, and so on. And the Russian diaspora can play a huge role also in disseminating these narratives that come out of Moscow and from its assets and agents. And what makes this report absolutely unique is there has never been a single list of published facts and organizations where the media and journalists can actually reference to understand whether they should be paying a bit more attention to the sources of information they're using and whether they should cast a more critical eye over the narratives they're receiving from a range of publications and individuals who may have connections to the Russian world. At first, this resource was only produced in English and Ukrainian, but Texty have been working hard to adapt it into a range of local languages to ensure their materials have a far wider reach and impact in fighting Russian propaganda. And I'll post links to the site. You may find some of the individual articles very interesting. They cover a diverse range of weaponized Russian narratives. Those around Kadyrov and Prigozhin being the good guys, which is a typical narrative. They seek to undermine that. There's the germs of the Russian world that I've just mentioned. There are also narratives around the evil intentions of the Poles and the threat from Poland, which is another favorite Russian narrative. And then various others, including old favorites like the secret biolabs, the genetically modified mosquitoes, and of course, throwing out numerous reasons as to why Russia started the war, which are designed to make Russia look better and hide the fact that this is a genocidal, imperialist war of aggression. Russian narratives also seek to undermine trust in the Ukrainian government and officials, and stories about Western weapons being sold to buy luxury cars as another area where Texty reproduces the kind of narratives that are being disseminated and shows which sources are propagating those false stories. And finally, Silicon Bytes wouldn't be complete without a delve into Russian clown world. And let's start by Vladimir Solovyov, who is in a positive mood today. He's been pushing the story of the Durham report in the US. It seems to be a major gift to the Kremlin propagandists, as well as something being peddled by Russian-friendly Republicans in particular. And Solovyov is speculating as to whether this report will help to further weaponize the American political system and potentially benefit Trump in his re-election bid in 2024. And as Julia Davis mentions on her Russian Media Monitor, it's not Russian state TV show without the mention of nuclear war. And the news that the UK will be creating a consortium to try and purchase F-16s, ship them to Ukraine and train up the pilots to fly them, as well as potentially building the infrastructure to help service that equipment. This has prompted the Kremlin propagandists to take another swipe at the UK, threatening Armageddon and declaring that Britain is trying to incite a world war. As has been pointed out by a number of commentators, To become a world war, Russia would need allies, and not even its friends like Belarus seem willing to send troops to support its aggressive occupation of Ukraine. It's not a world war if it's the world against Russia. And here is where I want to highlight the role of Russian propaganda in using Western individuals, useful idiots, assets, and agents to push its narratives. Tucker Carlson, of course, is one who's been in the news recently, but another is Scott Ritter. He is one of those individuals who often appears on Russian state media, claiming that he was persecuted in the US, persecuted for what he believed in, and is consistently critical of the US, its foreign policy, and complimentary about Russia and its aggressive war. He neglects, of course, to mention the real reason why he went to jail in the US. Now, to end this strand, because there's only a small amount of time I can spend in Clown World without my blood pressure raising to a dangerous point, I recommend you check out Vatnik Soup on Twitter, which is a thread produced every couple of days by Pekka Kalioniemi. In it, he analyzes individuals who are supportive of Russian narratives, but who are prominent in their own societies. Today, he's looking at Noam Chomsky, but you'll find an extraordinary archive of individuals and organizations in the US, in Europe, and the UK that consistently promote support for Russia while condemning their own societies and, of course, speaking negatively of Ukraine. It's an incredible resource, and I advise you to check that out if you aren't already subscribed. Well, that's it from Silicon Bytes. Happy Vyshyvanka Day. Slava Ukrainia, and we'll join you in a week's time when I'm sure a huge amount of new news will have accumulated for us to cover.